Hi, I'm Mike Beliveau, and today I'll be taking a look at an Old West lawman who deserves to be better known. El Paso, Texas Marshal Dallas Stoudenmire was involved in more gunfights than most of his better-known counterparts, and he successfully tamed one of the most violent towns in the Old West. Stoudenmire was also an excellent detective, and his services in that regard were in high demand across the Southwest. Stoudenmire was born in Aberfoyle, Alabama on December 11, 1845. In 1862, he joined the Confederate Army 3 times. The first time, Dallas was only 16 years old, and he enlisted without his mother's permission. Within 3 weeks, Ma Stoudenmire had complained to his commanding officer, and Dallas was promptly discharged from the Army. 3 weeks later, he once again enlisted and was again rapidly discharged when his mother lodged a complaint. The third time, Dallas waited about 5 months. By then, his mother had figured out that there was no stopping Dallas, and since he was nearly 18 years old, she didn't even try to get him discharged. Dallas served with the 17th Alabama Volunteers. He apparently had a very eventful war, though we don't have the details of his service, but we know he was wounded in action numerous times. He was severely wounded 4 times, but he continued to serve until the end of the war. Years later, an eyewitness in El Paso who saw Dallas at a bathhouse recounted that the 6-foot 4-inch tall marshal had the scars of 27 wounds on his body, and that he still carried 3 bullets that had not been removed. Sometime after the war, Dallas joined the Texas Rangers, and in 1874 he was serving as a second sergeant in J.R. Walker's company. Afterwards, after leaving the Rangers, he settled briefly in Colorado County, Texas, and that's where Dallas had his first recorded gunfight. Now, the name of Dallas's antagonist was not recorded, but apparently he and Dallas had a long, simmering antagonism towards each other. And when the two met by chance out on the Bernardo Prairie, they wasted no time. While they were still about 100 yards apart, both men drew their revolvers and began shooting. Neither man scored a hit, but they kept shooting and closing the distance, firing one shot after another. Finally, one of Dallas's bullets hit home, and Dallas stood there watching as his opponent bled out on the prairie. Not long after that incident, Dallas was attending a large party thrown by his German neighbors. An argument broke out that soon developed into a brawl, and that brawl progressed into a gunfight. Dallas was able to shoot several of his attackers, but he was wounded in the process and subdued by the opposing forces. Dallas was chained by his ankles to a heavy door handle, and a shotgun guard was set to watch him, and then the party continued. Now, Dallas's guard did not deprive himself of the whiskey that was flowing freely at the party, and eventually he passed out. Dallas took the opportunity to relieve the sleeping guard of both his keys and his shotgun. And then Dallas made his way out through the slumbering revelers to get medical attention for his gunshot wounds. Luckily, everyone who had been wounded at that fight survived, and no charges were ever filed, so I guess everyone just chalked it up to good high-spirited fun. In early April 1881, Dallas Stoudenmire traveled to El Paso, Texas, and was hired almost immediately. And on April 11, 1881, Dallas was sworn in as El Paso City Marshal. He was the 6th marshal that El Paso had had in just 8 months. Now, for over 200 years, El Paso had been a sleepy backwater hamlet. It had become, since Texas independence, a melting pot of Anglo and Spanish cultures, with intercultural marriages being very common and being virtually unremarked. But in May of 1881, all of that changed forever. That's when the tracks of the Southern Pacific Railroad reached El Paso. The railroad brought commerce and economic growth to El Paso, but it also brought prostitution, gambling, confidence men, and all manner of frontier riffraff that changed the sleepy town forever. And the influx of vice began even before the end of the line reached El Paso proper, as saloons, brothels, and gambling dens sprang up in the little town in anticipation of the booming business to come when the tracks finally did reach town. This was the charged atmosphere that Dallas Stoudenmire found when he arrived in El Paso to take up his duties as city marshal. El Paso had rapidly become a violent town, and the city fathers hoped that bringing in someone from the outside who had a reputation as a tough man would keep the lid on the town. As it turned out, that was a pipe dream. Now, Stoudenmire was an imposing man. As I said, he stood 6 feet 4 inches tall. He was all solid raw bone muscle. He was also a good, though not great, target shooter with a 6-gun. But when the lead was flying in both directions, Dallas was unflappable. Stoudenmire's main sidearms were a pair of big, ivory-gripped, 8-inch barreled, .44 caliber Smith & Wesson American model revolvers. He carried them in a pair of leather holsters on a heavy gun belt. But besides the Smith & Wessons, Stoudenmire also carried a .44 caliber 1860 Colt Richards Mason cartridge conversion revolver. This gun had had the ejector housing removed, and its barrel was shortened to around 2.5 inches. Stoudenmire usually carried this gun in a leather-lined trouser pocket as his backup gun. After being sworn in, Dallas's first task was to retrieve the city jail keys from Deputy Marshal Bill Johnson and to relieve him of his duties. Now, Johnson's principal vocation was operating the El Paso livery stable, but his passionate avocation was being the town drunk, and he was excellent at it. Was thoroughly intoxicated when Stoudenmire approached him and requested the keys. Johnson said that the keys were all mixed up on the same ring as his livery stable keys, and that he would have to go back to the stable and figure out which was which. However, Stoudenmire realized that Johnson would probably be unconscious long before he got back to the stable, so he demanded that Johnson turn over all the keys immediately so Dallas could sort them out himself at the jail. Johnson really didn't like that idea. He continued to delay, and Dallas became impatient with him and just took the keys from him and threw Johnson to the ground. Now, Johnson might have been drunk, but he wasn't too drunk to realize that he'd been humiliated by Stoudenmire in front of the whole town. And this set the stage for the most famous gunfight in El Paso history, the 4 dead in 5 seconds gunfight. And to set up that gunfight, I'm going to have to give you a little more background. The area around El Paso was a hotbed for rustling. Hardcasers stole cows in Old Mexico and drove them across the Rio Grande River to a pair of swamps called the Upper and Lower Bosques. From there, they were driven over the Franklin Mountains using a gap that was aptly named Smuggler's Pass, and into New Mexico, where there was next to no law enforcement at all, and they could be sold with impunity. Now, Captain George Baylor's company of Texas Rangers tried to short-circuit the rustlers on Texas soil. But once they crossed into Mexico, there was no law to speak of, and it was a free-for-all. Among the leaders of the outlaws were the 3 Manning brothers, James, John, and Frank Manning. They owned a small ranch near Cantutillo, which Captain Baylor considered to be the center of operations for organized cattle rustling in the area. Besides being the crime bosses in the countryside, the Mannings were also El Paso businessmen who owned saloons and gambling dens, and those were considered to be about the most legitimate businesses you could own at the time, and it made them leading citizens of that rough frontier metropolis. Unlike the bankers and the dry goods salesmen, the Mannings were not interested in having an effective city marshal. They were perfectly content with Bill Johnson in that role. In fact, they supplied most of the whiskey that kept Johnson from causing trouble with their operations. Now, it was right about at this time that 2 Mexican vaqueros named Warrique and Sanchez joined a Texas Ranger patrol to look for rustled cattle from their side of the border. And they were looking for it on the ranch of Johnny Hale, who was a rustling partner of the Manning brothers. During the search, 3 stolen cattle were located, but Hale protested the charge, claiming that he had bought the steers legally. And the Rangers ended up taking no action against Hale. Now, Hale's gunmen later ambushed Warrique and Sanchez as they made their way back to their Patron's ranch in Mexico. When the 2 vaqueros failed to arrive at their Mexican headquarters, a large party of armed Mexican vaqueros crossed the river into El Paso, and they asked Deputy Marshal Gus Krempow to help them find the bodies. Krempow was a former Texas Ranger and was widely acknowledged to be a fair lawman. So Krempow and the vaqueros were joined by a Texas Ranger named Fitch and several of the leading citizens of El Paso. They quickly discovered the bullet-riddled bodies of Warrique and Sanchez. It was obvious that they had been ambushed as they sat eating their lunch. Krempow and the vaqueros loaded the bodies onto a buckboard to transport back to El Paso, while Ranger Fitch peeled off with another group to follow the killer's trail, which led back to the Hale Ranch. That's where he arrested a pair of Hale's gunmen, Peevler and Stevenson. But after taking them back to El Paso, the pair were quickly released on bond, and they promptly fled town. An inquest had been called, but without the accused, it became a farce. And Hale himself showed up to claim to be an eyewitness that the vaqueros had ambushed Peevler and Stevenson, despite the fact that Warrique and Sanchez's bullet-riddled bodies clearly showed that they had been shot from behind. Ultimately, the inquest got nowhere and no warrants were issued for the murders. Now, tensions ran high as the Mexicans naturally bristled at the miscarriage of justice. But Marshal Stoudenmire managed to defuse the situation and get the Mexicans to return over to their side of the Rio Grande. Thinking he had calmed the situation, Dallas Stoudenmire left to get a meal. But while he was gone, one of Manning and Hale's hired guns, George Campbell, began calling for the lynching of anyone who had supported the Mexicans. Gus Krempow warned Campbell that he better not be talking about him. Campbell backed down, but Johnny Hale put a revolver into Campbell's hands and said, "Turn loose, Campbell, I've got him covered." With that, Hale drew and fired his other revolver, hitting Krempow beside his heart, and the bullet passed through his lung. But Krempow was tough. As he was falling, he drew his own revolver. Now, at the sound of the shot, Marshal Stoudenmire ran out of the restaurant across the street where he was having lunch and immediately fired at Hale while he was still on the run. Unfortunately, he shot too fast and he missed Hale, and he struck an innocent bystander. But Stoudenmire kept shooting, and his second bullet exploded Hale's head like a melon. Now George Campbell turned to face Stoudenmire with Hale's revolver still in his hand. He swung the gun back and forth as if he was trying to cover everyone in sight, but his words were at odds with his belligerent posture. Campbell yelled, "Gentlemen, this is not my fight." But of course the gun in his hand said differently. Deputy Gus Krempow, even though he was terribly wounded by Hale's bullet, began firing at Campbell. Krempow's first bullet hit Campbell's wrist, shattering it and forcing him to drop his gun. Now, at that point, Campbell did probably the most foolish thing he could have done under the circumstances. He bent down and scooped up the fallen revolver in his left hand. Seeing that, Krempow shot again. This time he hit Campbell in the foot. By now, Stoudenmire had dispatched Hale, and he turned to face Campbell. And without any hesitation, he put a slug right into his stomach, dropping him groaning into the street and effectively ending the gunfight. Gus Krempow soon succumbed to his wound and passed away. He was the last victim of the infamous 4 men dead in 5 seconds gunfight. And that gunfight pretty much is the most famous gunfight in El Paso city history. And it did a lot to establish Dallas Stoudenmire's reputation as a gunman. But Dallas was not just a gunman. He was actually a brilliant detective, and he was in high demand as a detective across the southwestern frontier. Unfortunately, Dallas's drinking had become a terrible problem, and that ultimately cost him his main job as the city marshal of El Paso, and ultimately it cost him his life. Now, Stoudenmire, who had been fired as the city marshal of El Paso, was working as a deputy U.S. Marshal across the Southwest. But even though he no longer had an official position in El Paso, his feud with the Manning brothers continued, and it was becoming a cause of major consternation among the more peaceful citizens of El Paso, who tried to broker an end to the feud. On September 18, 1882, a meeting was brokered between Stoudenmire and the Manning brothers. Ostensibly, the meeting, which was held in one of the Manning saloons, was to try to negotiate an end to the feud, but peace was not in the cards. A fourth brother of the Mannings, Dr. Felix Manning, known as Doc, soon got into an argument with Stoudenmire, and before you knew it, they both had pistols in their hands. Doc fired first, shattering Stoudenmire's right arm and causing him to drop his gun. A second bullet hit Stoudenmire's shirt pocket, which was filled with papers. And that thick wad of papers stopped the bullet from breaking through and entering his chest cavity. But the force of it knocked him backwards into the saloon doors and then out into the street. Now, Dallas was equally competent shooting with his right or his left hand, so he drew his left side Smith & Wesson, and he shot Doc as he came through the door, hitting him in the arm. Doc's brother, Jim Manning, followed and fired 2 shots, one going wild and the other one hitting Stoudenmire behind his left ear, killing him instantly. The former marshal was now dead, but an enraged Doc Manning proceeded to pistol whip Stoudenmire's corpse with his gun. And this marked the unfortunate end of Dallas Stoudenmire. He had been one of the West's best-known detectives, but he was all too flawed as a human being. I hope you enjoyed this look at Dallas Stoudenmire and his most famous gunfight. If you did, you know what to do. Thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, subscribe. Leave a comment. All that helps with the algorithm. And I will see you all next time. Till then, bye.